Welcome to the Igniting Change podcast. My name is Duncan Cook, founder of Three-Sided Cube, trusted technology partner for some world-changing organizations. We know the power that technology has to have a positive impact on people's lives. But on this podcast, myself and my co-hosts Puff and Sophie are out to meet the people behind the technology, hear their stories and understand what drives them, and hopefully inspire others to join the mission and do some good in the world.
Hello! Welcome back to another episode of Igniting Change on our podcast. So today we are very lucky to have Amina Hersey with us. She is the Head of Gender Rights and Justice at Oxfam International. So this is part of our series for International Women's Day, which is obviously happening in March. So very excited to talk to Amina today. The theme for our conversation is going to be around the feminist movement in the era of shrinking digital and civic spaces. So we will get on to these. Really excited to talk to Amina today. So thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. So Amina, can you start by just telling us a bit about yourself, who you are, your role and the organisation that you work for?
Yes. Hello and hi everyone. My name is Amina Hersey. I am the head of the Gender Rights and Justice team with Oxfam International, and currently based in the UK, though originally from Kenya, and having actually very relevant to this topic, have had to move from my birth country to the UK for safety reasons and for my activism and family activism, actually. So yeah, really happy to be here. What we do in terms of what I mean by gender rights and justice is we really prioritize trying to end all forms of discrimination, violence against women, girls, and non-binary people across the world, and try to address the root causes, including, for example, patriarchy, capitalism, neocolonialism, to end oppression for the most marginalized and historically marginalized people and communities across the world, to alleviate poverty and end injustices.
Amazing. So just the
small things.
Yes. That's absolutely incredible. And I had a little stalk of your LinkedIn, so you have an extremely impressive background. And similar to a lot of the people that I've been lucky enough to speak to, your background is you've always worked in third sector, right? So in that kind of for good space. I think it's one of those things, once you get into that space, is then very difficult to leave it. So you had a stint in Amnesty International as well, I believe. So yeah, it's just absolutely incredible work. So, and obviously you're at Oxfam International now. So thank you so much for that. So as I said, today we're going to be talking about the feminist movement. So in the kind of the modern day, I guess, sort of in those shrinking digital and civic spaces. So can you start by just telling us what we mean when we say sort of shrinking digital spaces, and then what kind of challenges the feminist movement is facing in light of that shrinkage?
No, absolutely. And I think I want to situate this conversation and discussion around the current context that we're experiencing. So maybe to try and articulate what we mean by shrinking civic space, but also digital civic space. Firstly, we are seeing a decrease in relevance of traditional champions of civic space amongst perhaps Western states in the North, donors, multilateral institutions who are no longer seen or recognized as the sole guardians of global norms on civic space. So where before, for example, the UN and human rights declarations were, really propagated centered in the global North, that power, that relevance, that traditional champions of we are the holders of these fundamental human rights has really been watered down, and we are seeing a lot of discrepancies. We're seeing a lot of double standards, and essentially, with the growing trends of illiberal democracies, neoconservative policies, and authoritarian tendencies, several countries are basically diluting and actually restricting and regressing the hard-won gains in terms of the cornerstones of human rights and our foundations on, freedoms of association, assembly, and expression. The second part is because of the polycrises that we're having, we are seeing militarism, being stoked, as we literally are seeing right now, across the world. And that is being, is creating scarcity mindset where there's rationale for deprioritizing basic essential services and rights, but also deprioritizing gender justice and human rights for this aspect of the militarization and security agenda. So I think there's what we mean is essentially because of this, there's a lot of shrinking civic space. People's rights and fundamental freedoms are being restricted. Organizations and third sector, as you call them, stakeholders are more and more being moved to the margins of society. And ultimately, we are seeing less engagement and more fighting to actually participate and actively engage to safeguard our rights as we know them. I think with this in mind, just to move on to the second part, in terms of what are the challenges for feminist movements, we are seeing a systemic and systematic assault on feminist movements across the world. We know that, feminist movements and activism has proven to be the most vital and most consistent factor driving progressive policy change towards gender justice. Yet the rising tide in anti-gender and anti-rights movements, who were once on the margins, are becoming well-funded and organized in waging regressive attacks to restore patriarchal order or so-called traditional values and reverse gender justice and human rights advancements across the world. So, we are seeing the state machinery being used to try everything possible in their capacity to curb feminist activism. And their tactics vary, so I'm just going to try and highlight a few of those examples. For example, copycat legislations on the criminalization of same-sex marriages, to restriction of NGO funding and licensing, or direct attacks on individuals or groups through whether it's digital spaces or actually media, traditional media, or personally within communities. These tactics we're seeing replicated and exported, but they all serve the common goal of silencing women in all their diversity and preventing the advancement of gender justice. This repressive condition has a direct impact on feminist movements, apart from the direct threats and the overt harassments or threats of arrests or even death. They also severely have resource restrictions, so reduction in budgets to women's rights organizations. It's been, I think, 30 years since the Beijing Declaration, where there was financial commitments being made for women's rights, and those were just all hollow promises, and have completely dissipated in thin air, to be honest. In fact,
Yeah.
I think most governments are trying to defund and shut down women's rights organizations as we speak.
Yay.
Yeah, and it's very visible across the world, whether from the global north, global south, it's everywhere. So we just need to really fight these forces head on, and ensure that feminist movements are therefore really, resourced and demand that, especially I think this International Women's Day theme around investing in women, that is really important, and a great logo and great tagline, with real, realities of feminist activists across the world.
Thank you. Yeah, the International Women's Day from the UN, like I said, the theme of invest in women and accelerate change. I think it's amazing because it is kind of a tangible thing. It isn't sort of some inspiring, fluffy, like, yay, let's just try harder. It's like, no, we just need some actual money. The funding would be great. I think it's so interesting, everything that you said. I mean, I don't know if this is something that you can kind of contain into one sort of question. But do you know, I mean, sort of listening to everything that you're saying, and I'm sure people listening are sort of thinking the same thing. Do we have an idea of why this is happening? Like, why does there feel like there's this sudden fight? Like you say, feels like we're having to fight to re-win battles that have been won, things getting overturned. Is there kind of I'm sure there's not one reason.
No, I don't think there's one reason, but I think this increasing trend that we're seeing around like really trying to polarize populist movements are growing more and more. And because of that, what works and the tactics that are being used to basically essentially, create this very polarized society is that we are seeing more and more blatant, leaders who come online and speak to people around things that they know has had historical and, backing in terms of the hard-won fights like that, whether it's civil rights movements or, Stonewall, like there's so much work that has had to be done to name the problem and name the systems of oppression, but also really try to push the system to a point where it recognizes that these are oppressions, and right now through really sophisticated tactics of listening, of trying to change and shift people's social norms to accepting what was once traditional values. Let's go back to the better days, but better days for who, right? And because right now we are living in a very there's a lot of it's a polycrisis from the economy to climate change to people are trying to grasp onto something that perhaps they once knew, right? And that is being used, I think, against many of us, right? In whether we know it or not, governments and populist governments in particular are gaining so much more momentum than we've ever seen before. And when I say illiberal democracies is we are seeing it in our eyes, and yet active participation of engaged citizens are actually going to the polls and voting these people in, and it's quite surprising, but at the same time it's not.
It's astonishing. It is when you watch things play out and you see it and you're like, this is like something out of a dystopian novel. How is this happening? This is like Handmaid's Tale in real time.
Exactly. The dissonance is crazy.
It is, and the normalization. I'm sure there's a phrase for it, but that thing where you just kind of start accepting. You're like, oh, okay, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. That was like
exactly,
absolutely horrendous. But then it felt almost kind of inevitable as soon as it was being talked about. It was like, well, yeah, this is going to happen. I think. Maybe after, a few political events that happened sort of 2016, 2018, things that you go, that will never happen. That, of course, that won't happen. And then they happen. You're like, okay, well, God, maybe there is that scope. And I think it's easy to get stuck in your echo chamber. So, I'm surrounded by people who think like me. And so we go, this will never happen. This is terrible. Of course they won't overturn Roe versus Wade. And then, you read about it in the news and you're like, what the hell? That phrase as well, the traditional values, is so insidious and so horrendous, and you see it a lot in particularly on social media. I've seen it's this huge thing of, and I think like you say, it's that grasping at the good old days. It's like, oh well, if women weren't so busy doing this, then the climate would probably be better. Like,
exactly.
Connecting those two things, man. But also, that's not how that works.
Exactly, and also how it's actually moving and being replicated from different jurisdictions, different states. You would never imagine that what is happening in Africa is happening in Europe and is happening in Asia. Exact same tactics being employed, and because it's worked. And so,
Well, yeah. If they know it works somewhere, then they'll try it somewhere else. Yeah,
exactly.
It is really shocking. I was sort of doing a bit of research around sort of disinformation, which we'll come to in a moment. But one of the sites I was looking at, there's a Women on Web, and that's been blocked in Spain and Turkey and South Korea. And I was like, that's in Europe. That's again, Women on Web, blocked in Spain. Doesn't add up at all to me. But they won't let their ads run on Google in Argentina, even though abortion is legal there. And it's just, the big tech side of it is absolutely terrifying, but so interesting. And in terms of, so we talked about some of the challenges, sort of that being, or some of the tactics rather, and then in terms of specifically the effects on sort of women human rights defenders and the queer movement, how does that look in this shrinking civil and digital space?
It's again extremely varied. Women and queer movements, feminist movements, women human rights defenders, land defenders, indigenous people in many countries are facing, I think, the across the board restriction to access to funding. I think that one we've already said. Exclusion to key decision-making spaces. I think this is more and more becoming a reality. And in fact, we are gearing up to go to CSW in March. And last year, just thinking about how, reflecting on my participation there was a complete division of NGO and CSO activities versus governments and member states, where there was complete delineation and exclusion of women's rights organizations. And this is one of the biggest moment for, it's a commission for women's status, and still like that they were still being excluded even in such spaces. So I think exclusion for key decision making spaces, gender-based violence and tech-mediated violence is an enormous effect that both women's rights, feminist and queer movements are facing without exception. It's affecting everybody in all their identities, in all whether you're in Kenya, whether you're in the UK, same exact experiences that they're facing. Femicides and assassinations, a lot more of that is actually happening as a result of shrinking space. And as you were talking earlier, smear campaigns, disinformation is really being used as a tactic to discredit a lot of women and queer people. And then the backsliding of the policies and commitments to gender equality, which we have fought so hard for and underpins a lot of our work, right? So I think this is one of the most worrying trends, because we try to change systemically issues from forefronts, right? So it's hearts and minds in terms of social norms, social like gender stereotypical issues. It's around trying to influence the media. It's around trying to influence policy and advocacy, and trying to make sure that there's accountability, and then making sure that people are able to claim their own rights. So I think in each of these four spheres of change, we are seeing complete regression, and it's impacting, most of us in our daily lives, but also in our work. I think just to put it in context, between 2015 and 2019, the UN reported that I think 1,325 human rights defenders were killed in 64 countries around the world. And today it reports that women human rights defenders are one of the most targeted groups being killed as we speak. So I think that for me is just a very stark reality that we face. And just to also add that with the numbers, there's a report that recently just came out from the organization Kvina till Vinna, and it was showcasing concerns around harassment and threat against women and queer rights activists. And it actually said that 75% of the respondents of their survey actually were being harassed and were facing threats. That means 1 in 4 activists have either received death threats, according to this report. So it's really ingrained in not only the, as we say, civic space and talking about, you know, the spaces in which we can actively participate. There is a direct personal and interpersonal reality of physical and, you know, sometimes emotional mental violence meted on those who are trying to engage actively. And I think on the funding side in particular, we are seeing, like, instead of the support that we were anticipating, especially during this really crucial times where we're living through a poly crisis, you know, we're actually seeing more funding for the anti-rights, anti-gender forces. And as we say, like the criminalization and deprioritization of gender rights, but also of human rights in general. So it's a very worrying time, actually, for all of us.
It must be a tough time to be in your space. I mean, I think, you know, the thing that you mentioned earlier about the backsliding, I think that is, like you say, one of the biggest worries, just because, you know, you think it's hard enough. It's still trying to get to that place of equality. It already feels like a big enough task. To be backsliding, to be regressing is just really, really tough and really demotivating. And I think it's really important to stay motivated, of course, because we can't just accept it. But yeah, I can imagine it must be really tough. And especially when it's, like you say, it's not even just kind of that backsliding in policy. It's the physical threats of violence. So it's like, it's not just, oh, this might not get through. It's, I might die if I just speak on behalf of women and vulnerable people. And you know, my family might be affected. And, you know, like you say, you've sort of experienced that, having to move firsthand and just for speaking out for women. And I think it's just absolutely horrendous. Like you say, really, really tough time. And you would think in this time where there is so much going on, like you say, the sort of poly crisis, you kind of would have loved to see everyone pull together and be like, all right, let's just park the gender. Let's just, you know, let's all work together on these big things around the climate and all the rest of it, just to try and make that better. Not just double down on the gender rights. That sucks. And I think the technical side as well, obviously working in tech myself, it's a big area of interest, and people that I've spoken to on the podcast in the past, it's such an interesting area. I spoke to a guy called Michael last week, who is head of human rights and technical at Amnesty International USA, or Amnesty USA, sorry. And we were talking about the fact that, you know, human rights kind of and digital rights are one and the same. You know, you're banking and the access that you have to information and everything, it's just, there's so much overlap now that if there is a restriction on that technical, it does become a human rights issue. And I think for women in particular, on lots of women's rights, like reproductive rights, you know, it's the disinformation, the removing of information, so like blocking particular hashtags and things like that, removing information from websites or blocking websites altogether. It makes an issue like abortion a political issue instead of a health issue, and it's insidious and horrible. So if we move on to the more positive, what kind of solutions can we kind of talk about in terms of creating the positive spaces? Come on, you need to build us back up.
We do. And our one call is always to fund change for a feminist future. We truly, really include this in all our call to actions, because I think re-envisioning a bold world where our rights are respected, we can live with dignity and safe from all forms of violence is something worth holding on to in all ways. In terms of For me, I think civic space and restrictions and patriarchy go hand in hand, and you just touched upon this a little bit. I think we are seeing it disproportionately affecting women, especially from historically oppressed backgrounds in the global south. And we can counter this by creating safe, diverse, active, civic space. We want a space where feminist movements can thrive, that allows for their equal, safe, and meaningful participation at all levels, whether it's in the home or, in the streets or in decision-making spaces. Like having the meaningful participation, I think, is the most important thing. I would break it down a little bit in terms of one, governments and major funders need to make a political choice. They have to have the political will to fund and support gender justice. We always put our money where we think is most important. And so far, we have seen that gender justice is not a priority because of how little funded it is. And this is across the board. So I think that would, really, we are tired of the rhetoric. We're tired of commitments. Like, start implementing. Put your money where your mouth is.
Put your money where your mouth is, 100%.
That's really important. The second is around really supporting and going beyond the individual empowerment of women in formal NGO establishments. So we definitely want for feminist queer movements to be supported from the local grassroots levels, but it has to be more than that. They're already positioned to create change. They, in all crises, in all events, in all spaces, those who are directly affected are the first to try and change their reality. And most of the times they do it without any kind of support or any kind of backing. So it's about recognizing their leadership. It's about giving them the tools, the resources to actually, drive policy change, to engage in meaningfully creating solutions for their own realities and experiences, and capturing that information in a very systematic and sometimes also really important gender disaggregated, data, so that we can analyze, we could really be informed when we are putting, whether it's money, resources, allocation to evidence-based information. So that's the second thing. And then I think it's around really trying to hold on and safeguard and protect the laws that are already progressive and gender progressive in particular, and trying to eliminate all laws that restrict or criminalize the work that human rights defenders or feminist and queer movements do. It's almost counterproductive to not only ban, for example, and ban like safe abortion, but also ban anyone who speaks up about safe abortion, right? Like, you're literally silencing the whole world almost in one by signing one policy. And the pen is a really important tool that people sometimes also like negate to recognize. And I think that criminalization of policies, like of realities of freedoms, is something that we just need to always keep pushing for. And then lastly, I think it's around ensuring an enabling environment. So coming back to my first point, making sure that women human rights defenders are protected, they're supported, and their legitimacy is recognized. We do not have many states that actually have legislation in place that protects the rights of women human rights defenders, of peace activists, of feminist and queer movements. We don't. We have, the cornerstones of like freedom of expression and association and assembly. But even that, civil liberties in law are being eroded. So like how to go beyond the theory of it and try and create laws that protect the people who defend this cornerstones of our freedoms is really important. And I think just creating mechanisms for like a really gender sensitive protection mechanism to enable them to participate actively in all forms of our lives is really important. So I would say those four, I think, are the main areas that I would suggest.
Yeah, that's amazing. And all of those things are, like you say, sort of positive things that can happen. I think the protecting and supporting the feminist sort of activists is a really, really important one that speaks to me a lot. I think it, particularly in the UK, I think when you sort of talk about being a feminist and being an activist and stuff, it's prone to real kind of eye rolling and like, come on, surely we're equal by now. Like, you've got more or less everything you wanted. That's fine, right? And you think, God, so it's only, if you think of it as a spectrum, it's like, so it's only when women are being kind of murdered in the streets or whatever, that's when you think it's worth talking about women's rights. But, as long as you're sort of roughly paid the same, then that's fine. It is crazy. And it can be quite difficult, I think, to hold on to that when you are looking at, because it's easy to go, well, I mean, relatively speaking, I guess we're okay. And then, you start diluting it. And you think, no, that is not what we want to accept. That kind of, that sort of like almost equal is enough. It's, it's not, not about that. And when you look at what people are sort of talking about, when you talk about that feminist activist, it's like, it's not much, guys. It's like very basic human rights and, the stuff we kind of talked about earlier, the ability to talk about things without feeling a threat of violence, not facing endless, horrible, horrifying comments online if you dare to talk about something outside of your space. Or just, it is crazy. So anything to sort of support and defend and protect the kind of the activists, I think, is really important, to make them feel like there is that safe space, particularly if it is kind of that online where you can just sort of send an email, send a message or whatever to just say, like, I support you, I see what you're doing, and I appreciate it, I think. But then it is that, like you say, it's the systemic side of things. It's the governments and the bigger sort of organisations that can make that kind of the bigger difference, I guess. I saw a stat, and we'll talk about funding and financing next, but around 5% of government funding going towards gender violence for women and girls, and like less than 1% on prevention. So it's kind of like, it's a really small amount anyway, and then it's reactive. So it's like, well, once it's happened, then we'll believe it and then we'll support. But the fact that the preventative funding is so low, it's so shocking and disheartening. But so what we talked earlier about the UN's theme for this year, so for International Women's Day, so it's invest in women and accelerate progress. So how does funding and financing play a role in this positive space?
Funding and financing ensures the long-term sustainability of all the efforts that I say me because we I consider myself as part of the feminist movement, so
Great,
I'm gonna keep saying we
definitely, please do.
that we need, right? So and the kinds of areas that we have identified that really needs our effort and our space to make a difference and to make a change. When we advocate for funding, we're not asking just for mere cash, and I think you were just touching upon this earlier. We're asking for resources that enable us to break the chains of our current financial systems. So it's not charity. It's not like give us grants to do some activities. Like, that's not essentially what we're asking for. Money. The money accumulated by governments, by corporations, and billionaires has been taken from the backs of women, girls, and gender diverse and non-binary people. And it is, exploiting their labor and productivity to keep them in low-paid and precarious jobs with no access to resources. And whether it's, public services or social protection or, shouldering the responsibilities of unpaid care work, struggling to make ends meet. Like, we are talking about making positive policy choices around resource and financing rather than prioritizing, for example, military budgets. There was a start that we actually, in a report during the COVID pandemic, that said if governments were able to just take 2% of their military spending, they would be able to fund the prevention of ending gender-based violence during COVID in 132 countries. And just 2% of their military budgets, not all of it,
not 98%,
not 98%, 2%.
Yeah.
And we're seeing more and more of this when we see even in the UK talking about austerity, measures, but the first cuts are to domestic, abuse services or the NHS or education. These are spaces where majority women work, and social workers, 75% of them are women. And so, like, when we're talking about financing them, it's not just for their organizations, but for their lives and their livelihoods to be able to actively participate, to be able to call out, when there's a policy that is not working. As a mother, what if I don't have, enough money to even travel to London when a bill is being passed in Parliament that affects me? How am I gonna engage? I'm gonna prioritize my family. I'm gonna prioritize my children, and that's the reality across the world. Not unique for me, at least. It's across the world. If people don't have the funding to have a decent and dignified life where their socio-economic and cultural, rights are respected, then their civic, rights and political rights will not materialize either. And I think that coexistence of those two, I would say inalienable rights, because they are fundamental rights. We can't separate them, and we have to recognize when we're saying funding, that's what we mean. It's really saying breaking the chains of imposed, by colonialism, by patriarchy, by capitalism, and creating and ensuring that we are unconditionally supporting and funding feminist movements and women across the world who would actually create that vibrant civic space that pushes us to a feminist future that we want to see.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, and so important as well to make that distinction around the funding. Like you say, it's not just grants, which are also important to do the research or to do whatever needs to be done, but the wider thing of like supporting, the jobs that women typically do and allowing women to have the same sort of level of flexibility. I was speaking to Elizabeth Shaughnessy, who works for Oxfam USA, and we were talking about the gig economy, and she was saying about how, everyone sort of says, oh, the gig economy, it's great, it's flexible, whatever. So just as a woman, just get a job in the gig economy. And it's like, cool, the gig economy is like horribly, horribly biased towards men because there's huge risks of violence. And, so it's never as simple as it kind of seems on the surface. And it is about, well, why not invest in a gig economy that is suited and safe for women? It's not even just like, oh, we don't fancy doing that job. It's like there is a fundamental safety issue here. Provide support in a financial means, like you say, put your money where your mouth is, to actually give the opportunity for women to work in a flexible way that means that they don't have to be scared for their lives. Not asking for much. Feels like the bar is very, 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 very low.
Exactly.
It's when you start talking about it, it's like, God, it really isn't. It's not that complicated. And I think you sort of touched on there about COVID as well. I think the financial impact on women during COVID was just, from various bits that I've read, just absolutely horrific. Just in terms of the sort of childcare and the assumed position that women would take of like, well, someone's got to stop working, so that's you. And then what that does in terms of the financial freedom that women have and the safety, then the ability to leave, and then the funding on the domestic violence shelter. It's just... astonishing and felt like a real step back. And I think the problem is that the steps backwards can happen so quickly, and then the rebuild is so slow because it's systemic, and it's, you know, it takes time to get back to even where you were, and kind of comes back to that thing we were talking about earlier of the regressions are so disheartening because it's like, oh man, we're not even sort of getting there, we're actually in a worse position. So I think the last few years have been tough, and I think that key, like you say, the long term and sustainable as well, right? That's the key with the funding. It's like, don't just hand out a small token grant and be like, there we go, we care about women, box checked. It's like, you know, properly invest in proper sort of things that will actually allow women to thrive and have that kind of positive space, like you say. So, and in terms of sort of what people who are listening can do, so talking about that sort of activism and the grassroots organisations, so what can be done to kind of achieve that meaningful representation and achieve the gender justice that we want so badly?
I love this question because I'll give one of my favorite quotes is by June Jordan, which I think rings true today as it did when she wrote it. She says, "I've always had to invent the power my freedom requires."
Very nice.
And I think it's such a powerful representation of grassroots and local feminist queer organizations. Some of the biggest and systemic changes we've achieved have been by grassroots movements, you know, and that, you know, gender justice is no exception, be it historically from, you know, the fight of women's rights to vote, or, you know, the rise of Black feminists who fought for, you know, against racist establishments, whether it's in the US or colonial eras in Africa. It's been an ongoing organization and organizing of their struggles and fighting for their freedom, and having the power within to basically show up and demand, you know, their rights. So they've been at the forefront of change collectively and building power. Their role is crucial and will always be crucial. In fact, just an example of Kenya, where I'm from, you know, we have about 1,000 local grassroots organizations currently who are organizing against the increase of femicides in Kenya, and using, you know, the hashtag of shutdown KE. They've mobilized nationwide, you know, marches across and demanding that femicide be recognized as a national emergency, and that actually the government embeds, you know, key policies and investment in ending this. So I think, just to highlight a few, we've had Say Her Name, Ni Una Menos, Me Too, and then, you know, the movements are countless from different regions, from different continents, and the reality is that we need to provide them with adequate resources. We need to be able to, you know, try and tackle some of the barriers that they face and support them in solidarity, and ensure that, you know, to try and counter the failed trickle-down approach of neoliberalism, you know, with the bottom-up approach of empowerment. Nice. You know, these grassroots organizations are agents of change, and recognizing them, that we want them to fight for the injustice. We want them to continue being the change makers in calling for the, you know, equality and alleviation of poverty. And just to say that I think it's important to, as much as grassroots, you know, like I think Shali Chisholm, I never know how to pronounce her name. Shom, that's it. You know, said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. Like, it's important, as much as they have that, you know, agency to fight back and create their own representation and create their own power to fight injustices. It's important for organizations like ours, like Oxfam, who have the power or access, adjacent power, I wouldn't say power, but adjacent to power, to enable, to facilitate, to support organizations to be in those spaces so that they are speaking for themselves, making sure that it's important for, local organizations and grassroots to engage in policy, to design and lead and plan actions of change, but also in terms of protection mechanisms, accountability mechanisms, for them to have a say in what that looks like, as it ultimately will impact them in one way or another. So I think there's, just to come back and wrap it up a bit, in terms of guaranteeing the meaningful representation, I think it takes all of us to play that role. They're doing their part, so we need to step up, and we need governments to step up and policymakers to step up. We need our, from the individual level to the community level to the decision-making levels, at all spaces to really step up and but enable A, for the recognition of their leadership, and B, for their meaningful engagement and representation, because otherwise we are either talking to ourselves or we are basically creating policies that are so ill-informed and have no impact, or actually could be counterproductive. So it's really important to start thinking about what that means, and also, am I the right person to be in this space? Should I be the one speaking for X people, or do I know somebody who actually would be better suited? So it's really about also checking our egos, checking our power and privileges, and creating that space, and really just, I think, if you're self-aware as well, and want positive change and long-lasting sustainable change, I think that's the problem. We need more people who want that, or at least at the power level areas, and then we get to see activists do what they do. Feminist organizations continue to fight with or without being given the space, or they're creating the power that their freedom requires in every day, and they will continue to do that. So I'm not worried about that. Actually, that's one of the things that really keeps me going and keeps me hopeful, and one of the main reasons that I always commemorate, I think, International Women's Day, is that it's a reminder of women's struggles for centuries, and I know that I am stepping on, the shoulders of other feminists and queer people who have fought for me to be able to speak about these issues, and it's phenomenal. And so I think just providing the space for them to do that would be fantastic.
Amazing, thank you. That was so insightful and so important, I think, to, like you say, sort of look at it with a bit of depth and sort of say, how can I support in the best way, rather than just kind of shouting the loudest or saying I'm an ally. It's that making space, I think, is really important, because obviously there's all the layers and the intersections, and so it isn't just as straightforward as being I'm a feminist. You have to take all of the other bits into account as well,
exactly,
and support where you can, where it's appropriate, in the best possible way. But thank you so much for that. I think it's really important to end on that kind of optimistic note, and I think, like you say, it's International Women's Day is so important, and it serves as such a wonderful reminder for, like you say, the women that have come before and kind of made the progress. So even when there is backsliding, it's overall we've still made progress, and it's good to remember that.
We definitely have.
cling on to that. It's fine, still progress. But I think it's really important to see it as a chance to look back, like you say, to look at the work that's been done, and to look forward to say, what is the next step? What is the next thing that we're working on? And like say, how can I support that in the best possible way to make space for the right people? Amazing. Exactly. Thank you so much for coming on today. This has been so interesting to talk through these issues, and I really appreciate your time. and your insight on this, because it's just, absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care.
Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.